today I have a special video. More in depth, I have a special guest in my video. It's Pineapple. This guy really inspired me to do this YouTube thing. So it's kind of crazy that I actually now have a collab video going with him. And he took the initiative to send me some starters over. So I went over the starters, which I got. You know, this is cool. This is also very cool. But then I had this one. So you already know I had to flip this one.
Alright, so then for the starter, I went ahead and started off with a lead called Gem from one of Sunboy's one-shot kits. Overall, it's just a really nice high-pitched sound to build a melody around. Alright, so then here's the MIDI for this, and overall it looks super complex right now, but it's really just a 2-bar pattern that gets duplicated over for the rest of the time. And if we go ahead over here and just look at this section, I'll pitch it down to D sharp just so I can explain a little bit better. But it's really 3 layers: the root notes duplicated down an octave, so that's like the chords layer kind of, a slide note layer, so that's only 2 notes, and then this top line layer. So for the root note layer, I went ahead with the root note of the melody being D sharp, and then did B and then A sharp, which are next to each other in the scale, which I mentioned in my videos a lot of the time. If you use notes next to each other in the scale, they really kind of give off a darker feeling, so it's great to pair with aggressive synths to kind of get this dark hyperpop kind of feel. So after I had the root notes figured out, I went ahead and chopped it up like an 808. So if you see here, this is basically how an 808 would hit, like the most basic pattern you can think of. And then I went ahead and switched it up here with putting it down an octave and then just kind of speeding it up a little bit and then chopping it up in these last 2 chords. So then for those last 2 chords, you can see if I select it, the velocity is declining. And how you do that is if I go ahead and normalize these velocities, you can hold right click on the first note and then drag down to get a nice even sweep. So then for the slide notes, I just have them going down an octave right before the chop ends, so it kind of just makes it a little bit more interesting. And then I have a teeny tiny little break, just a little break on the ears because those slide notes are super aggressive. And then finally for the top line, again using notes next to each other in the scale, just making these simple patterns. And this is again kind of like the pattern that's used in Money So Big. I like to use that in a lot of these hyperpop melodies. And then I also just paired that with this really quick descent, and I believe this is in quarter step and not half step. But again, like all the other notes in this, it uses notes next to each other in the scale and just goes down really fast. And then again, like those chords I chopped over there, the velocities are declining with the same method of holding right click and going down. So you can see in the second half of the 2-bar pattern, it's pretty much the same thing. This is put up an octave though, and this stays the same. And then all the rest of this is pretty much the exact same thing, just with variations of different parts of it being put up or down an octave. So it's really simple, and just some light transposing really gives it a bit of variation. And then for the effects on this, I went ahead and threw D-Blue Crusher, which is a free crushing plugin with a reduction at 2 samples, an EQ, which is automated in the arrangement just to give it even more variation, an EQ to cut the lows just to make room for an 808, and then finally an imager just to make it a tad more mono. So after making that pattern and adding effects, here's what it sounds like. Alright, and then the next sound is a synth called Acid, and it's from the Eclipse Serum Bank. Overall, just a good background chord sound. And then here's the MIDI for it, and as you can see, it's super simple, and it just copies the root notes of the MIDI. So there's really no explaining here, so here's what it sounds like. Alright, and then for the next sound, it's a bell called YEAT Bell 1, and I just went ahead and found this off Reddit off of a random YEAT drum kit, but overall it's a pretty solid bell, so I threw it in there. And then here's the MIDI for this, and overall again, it's a super simple MIDI, and this just copies the chords pretty much again. This copies the same chops and velocity declines as those 2 chords that were there in the main MIDI, and then this F, of course, is the root note of the melody, so I just have a bunch of velocity changes and chops just to make it a little bit more interesting. So again, this is a super simple MIDI, so it doesn't need much explanation. So here's what it sounds like. Alright, and then for the next sound, it's another lead from one of Sunboy's kits, and it's the Goodbye lead. Overall, just a solid lead. I just threw it in there because it sounded pretty good. And then here's the MIDI for it, and again, it's just a 2-bar pattern that repeats with no variation. And if we go ahead and zoom in here, we can just see that we're using the notes next to each other in the scale. So if I were to put this back down into D sharp minor, you'd see we have the D, the F, and the F sharp, which are the notes next to each other in that scale, but I went ahead and pitched it up to F sharp minor. Then I just went ahead and added this little variation, and then copied that same roll again from the main MIDI, and also copied that velocity decrease. And then like I mentioned before, this just repeats for the rest of the time. So again, super simple, and here's what it sounds like. And then on the mixer for that, I have halftime on the 1 bar preset, and I have this on an automation clip just to throw in throughout the arrangement to, again, just add a little bit more variation. All right, and then for the next 2 sounds in the starter, it's 2 sounds that kind of get combined together, and they're both plucks from the Sunboy kit. So one is the hard pluck, and then one is the stay down pluck. Just 2 good plucks, and they sound really good when they're kind of combined. So for the MIDI on the first pluck, it's just a super simple pattern that does a kind of a clap pop pattern. I always like to have kind of an accent bell in my melodies just to kind of sit in the background, so this kind of fulfills that purpose. And then for the second MIDI, again, it's super simple and it just copies those same chops from the second chords, and then the velocity decreases as well. And then on the mixer for the second pluck, I have a pancake that I made myself. So basically each of those chords are panned to each ear, so it just sounds a little bit more interesting. So after making those 2 MIDIs and combining them together, here's what it sounds like. Alright, and then for the next 2 sounds in the starter, they're both bass sounds that I combined together. And I do this in my melodies a lot, but the first one is a preset I made myself in Serum. So it's basically just that basic like saw wave bass lead that you hear at like Ken Carson, Cardi, YEAT type beats. But it's basically just a sub plus a saw wave, and then I have the velocity automating a filter. And then the second bass is from the Stardust Serum Bank, and it's the B4 bass, and I just went ahead and added a sub on it just so it's a little bit more deep and aggressive. Overall, these 2 basses just really combine nicely together and make it super energetic. So here's the MIDI for the saw bass that I made, and overall it just copies the chords, but some are down an octave, some are offset a little bit, just trying to make it kind of offset and a little bit bouncy. And then like I mentioned before, the filter is automated and it's controlled by the velocity. So if you look down here, I have the velocities going kind of crazy, but that just makes it have a lot of variation because everything is hitting at like a different frequency. And then here's the MIDI for the B4 bass, and this basically just hits wherever the saw wave bass isn't. So it's super simple. They kind of bounce back and forth, and overall this is more of like a lower sub bass, so they mesh really nicely and like accent each other. And then on the mixer for those, I don't have anything on the before bass, but on the bass that I made, I went ahead and automated a low cut filter just so I can still have this playing when the 808s would be in the beat, just to have again some more variation and allow the bass to kind of stay in the beat but not compete for frequencies with the 808. So after making those 2 bass midis, here's what they sound like when you put them together. So yeah, and then after everything's put together and rendered out as a starter, here's what it all sounds like. Alright, yeah, so that's pretty much it for the starter.
So I thought the starter was so like, I don't know how to say that in English, but like well run. It's a song at its own. I just picked this and I didn't change anything. I didn't pitch it down. I didn't do none of this stuff. The first thing I did was I took these heads. It's my main head. It's the hi-hat chosen. It's probably from a Reddit pack. Always put a low cut on my hi-hats. We got these double notes in the beginning. You get that bounce going, you get that speed going. And then I had a stop right here and I just went down because I postponed the snare. This is something I really like to do. It's something very common in drill music. If you want to stand out from the rest a little bit more, you gotta do different stuff, man. So get on there and be creative. And then for the second part, I went pretty easy on the rolls and stuff. So what I did was double this note, and then I just had this a triplet, but it's like in quarters. It's crazy, but it feels really nice. I'm gonna let y'all hear it with the snare together. By the way, the snare I used was the meta snare from Producer Grind. Then I went on to the perks. I added this Southside snare. And I also added this, oh my god, Ronnie, Gucci Lips snare. Apparently that's a thing, Gucci Lips. I am gonna let y'all see the patterns together. With perks, it's really important to have the look of all your perks, because once you look at every perk like in a different track, you kind of miss the context and you miss out on a lot of bounce opportunities. So if you get it in this view, you'll actually see where you can create the bounce, where like the two perks are interfering with each other or where the two perks are creating extra bounce. Then I went on with the 808s. The 808s are quite crazy because I went a little bit easier on the rest of the drums. I just took the root note, which Pineapple put on the starter name. This is something I want to recommend to y'all. Put the scale name, the key name, just something to help the producer start with making the beat. Just put it on there. Loops and starters and midis are for fast-paced beat making, so make sure the person can actually use the starter, midi, loop, whatever it is, fast. I took the root note and I used it up an octave. I went down 3 half steps. So really the idea behind this is just going down the stair set of the scale. So I just went down 3 half steps, then 1 half step, then I went down another octave for this note, and that's really it. You just choose a bounce, and it doesn't really matter where the notes are. If you get that stairway downwards thingy, you will get some pretty insane beat drops. So now let's hear that in context with the rest of the drums. What I mostly do in my second part of my 808s is I go up 7 half steps from the root note, and then I went down from there. You know, right here there's one note that goes up, but that's really it. And just like play around with the notes and stuff. Don't be afraid to try different stuff. In the second part I always did like a kind of stair thingy, but like not this overdriven, if that makes sense. The important thing for this extra drive in the beat were these notes that are like kind of like a metronome, but it's the same hi-hat and an octave pitch down. I really like this, and I noticed from watching 808 Mafia TV, it's a really good technique to get those dirty drums going. And I also added this open head on top of every 808 to make it slap just a little bit more and have like that high-end excitement also when the 808 is kicking in and when the kick is coming in, of course, because I almost always layer it with this kick, and then when you add that all together you get the beat.
George. Pineapple.
Any questions about beat making or just questions from me, you can always reach me on the gram. Don't be afraid to message me. I answer every DM on Instagram, and I hope I can catch y'all in the next one. Have a great day.